So welcome to the inaugural webinar of the Making Baptist History Public History Project. My name is Dr. Andrew Gardner, and I am director of this program, and would like to welcome you on behalf of Reverend Dr. John Finley, the executive director of the Baptist History and Heritage Society. Our project and webinar this evening are generously funded through the American Historical Association in collaboration with the National Endowment for the Humanities. And all opinions, findings, suggestions, or recommendations of this webinar do not necessarily reflect those of the AHA or NEH or Baptist History and Heritage for that matter. This project seeks to promote public history and historical thinking around the role of Baptists the role Baptists have played in American religious life. Tonight, our webinar is virtually hosted by the First Baptist Church of Carrollton, Georgia, and we are grateful to First Baptist Church Carrollton for their work in promoting and advertising this program and even attending. Tonight's program will center upon Dr. Christopher Moore's work, Apostle of the Lost Cause, J. William Jones, Baptists and the Development of Confederate Memory. Dr. Moore is instructor of history and religion at Catawba Valley Community College and the incoming president of the Baptist History and Heritage Society. Following tonight's programming, I encourage you to go and purchase your copy of Dr. Moore's work at the University of Tennessee Press. You can use, I sent that to everyone. You can use code MORE22 and get 40% off a copy of that work until the end of May. I think that code goes till. Our second speaker for this evening is very familiar to folks at First Baptist Church of Carrollton. It's the Reverend David Hughes, the senior pastor of our host congregation this evening. Tonight's hour-and-a-half program will include roughly a 45-minute lecture from Dr. Moore on his recent book, and will be followed by a brief response and reflection from Reverend Hughes. The remainder of our time will be devoted to a Q&A from audience members for either or both speakers. And we ask to remind you that please mute yourselves during the part of the program when Dr. Moore and Reverend Hughes are speaking. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Moore.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gardner. I appreciate that introduction, and thank you to everyone who has registered for this webinar, the first of what will be a series of webinars held by the Baptist History and Heritage Society. And just to allay your fears, please know that if I bore you to the point of despair, that's not necessarily indicative of the subsequent webinars in this series. I'm going to begin sharing my screen here. And as I do, let me share a special thank you to Reverend Hughes and First Baptist Carrollton for hosting this event. I'd also like to begin with a story that will probably strike you as strange. It strikes me as strange. It is something that happened to me about 15 years ago in a small town, eastern North Carolina. On this particular afternoon, I was doing business at an ATM. And after I finished conducting my business there, I turned around, and standing behind me was a Confederate soldier, fully garbed Confederate soldier, from his gray kepi on his head to his brogans on his feet. And for some reason, I felt like I needed to say something to him. I don't know why. I'm not much for small talk, especially with strangers. And I stared at him and asked probably what is the dumbest question I could have asked in that moment. I asked, "Are you going to a reenactment?" Again, pretty dumb question to ask a Confederate soldier at an ATM. And he looked at me and said, yeah. And I recalled, okay, there is a reenactment happening about 10 miles away. And so I tried to walk away from this awkward conversation that I had begun, and then turned around again for some reason and said, well, good luck. I don't even know what that means. Good luck to a reenactor. And he said two words to me as I was walking away. He said, "We lose." And I said 2 words back to him: I know. And the reason I bring up that story is 2 reasons. First of all, when else would I get a chance to tell that story? The second reason is because it's a reminder to me that history is never static, that it's living, it's still happening. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that we can make when we're thinking about history is to assume that history is a mine of facts that is always there, that it's static and immutable, and that it's accessible, and that anytime we want to hook into it, we can. But instead, history is not necessarily what happened in the past. It's the story we tell ourselves about what happened in the past. And that story does change. That story is dynamic. That story is standing behind you at the ATM. And every time that story is told, it changes. Now, sometimes that story is rooted in primary sources. Other times, that story is barely tethered to reality at all. Now, having said that, let me introduce you to J. William Jones, a Baptist minister, Confederate chaplain, and one of the primary disseminators of a mythology that we refer to as the lost cause. Now, before we get too deep into this, I want to give a quick overview of the different strains of post-war memory that were circulating during the Civil War or after the Civil War. I think it's pretty safe to say that after the cannons fall silent, there emerges a battleground of competing narratives, each one jostling for preeminence. Historians such as Gary Gallagher and David Blight have outlined a number of strains of memory. I'm just going to talk about 4 very quickly here. The first goes without a lot of explanation. The first strain of memory that emerged after the American Civil War is something that scholars call the Union memory. Again, pretty self-explanatory. This was essentially saying that the American Civil War had been a war about Union. It's not hard to make that argument. That's what we see in many diaries of Northern soldiers. That's what we see in a lot of the correspondence of Abraham Lincoln, the Union strain of memory. The second strain of memory was emancipation. This was a strain of memory that said that the Civil War was all about the emancipation of 4 million enslaved persons. Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison would have said that the war was always about emancipation, even prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, even prior to Abraham Lincoln seeming to admit that openly. The war was always a war about slavery. A third strain of memory is sometimes called reconciliation, or the reconciliationist strain of memory. Now, on the surface, this one looks like it would be good. I mean, reconciliation in general is pretty good. However, and I'm going to come back to this point a little bit later in the lecture, this reconciliationist strain of memory usually appealed to white Northerners and white Southerners. It talked about reconciliation among whites, but normally relegated issues of slavery and race to the periphery. In other words, reconciliationists often praised what they thought were the quintessentially American virtues that the Confederacy and the Union had displayed during the war. Come back and talk more about this a little bit later. The majority of our time, I'd like to focus on this fourth strain of memory, which is the lost cause. This was primarily a white Southern mythology that is disseminated after the American Civil War. Now, if we're going to define the lost cause, there's a few ways we could do it. I have tried to put together what I think is a fancy academic definition. Different scholars will tweak this, have different definitions. This is what I think is a fancy academic definition of the lost cause. The lost cause was a sacralization of white Southern history that entailed a veneration of Confederate heroes, an apology for the Confederate cause, primarily in an attempt to preserve a distinctive Southern identity vis-a-vis Northerners. Say a couple of things here. Number one, that word sacralization, I'm borrowing that from a historian, Lloyd Hunter, a making sacred of white Southern history, infusing it with a sacredness. Also, this word apology, that doesn't mean, of course, Confederates saying, we're sorry. This is an apology in the sense of being a defense, a continued defense of the Confederate cause in a way of preserving a white Southern identity. Now, that's my fancy definition. Here's my snarky definition. I think the lost cause is how the South won the war. Now, of course, they didn't win the war, but I could point to a number of historians who would say that the South wins the battle for the narrative, at least in many parts of the country. White Southerners tell the story, and that story not only gets into the white Southern psyche, it literally gets into the school books. It literally becomes the way many white Southerners grow up thinking about the American Civil War. Now, there were a number of primary tenets of the lost cause. I'm going to just talk about three here. Again, other historians may point out have a lot longer list here, but for the purpose of keeping things nice and simple, I think you could boil down most lost cause tenets to three major points. The first tenet of the lost cause was that the South, or the Confederacy, had been overwhelmed by numbers and resources. They had just been overwhelmed by Northern industry, by Northern infrastructure, by Northern population, by Northern weaponry. All of this coalesces to make it essentially not a fair fight. That's always part of that narrative. We're overwhelmed because it really wasn't a fair fight. The second tenet was that the South was more virtuous than the North. Now, this one is a little bit more controversial, of course. Many white Southerners came to believe that white Southerners were more godly, were more biblical, were more Christian than their Northern counterparts. This also manifests itself in a type of Manichaean dualism between the leaders in the South and the leaders in the North. Robert E. Lee was a saint. Grant was a devil. Jackson is holy. Sherman is demonic. And so that's normally how that plays that out. And we're going to talk here in a second about what stories many white Southerners start appealing to prove what they think is the point, that they are more virtuous. This third point is the biggest, though, in my opinion. Lost causers, almost without fail, said that the American Civil War was not about slavery, that slavery was tangential to the conflict, that the war was about states' rights, about self-determination, about fighting for what you believe to be against government overreach. Any number of other reasons could have caused this war. Most white Southerners will tell you it did not have anything to do with slavery. And so just from this brief overview, you can probably see where I'm going to go with some of this lecture. We're still going to see some of these same arguments that unfold in the late 19th century. You're going to see those start resurfacing throughout the 20th century into the 21st century as well. So we come to J. William Jones. Like I said, J. William Jones, Baptist minister, Confederate chaplain, and one of the primary promulgators of this lost cause mythology. I'm going to give you I'm going to try to go through this pretty quickly too, a brief overview of his life, because I'd like to get to spend most of our time talking about his significance, both for Southern memory and for churches today. But really briefly, Jones was born in Louisa County, Virginia in 1836, underwent a conversion in 1855 at a Baptist camp meeting. 1855 was also the year that he enrolled at the University of Virginia. And after 4 years there, enrolled at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary when the seminary was still in Greenville, South Carolina. This is right as the seminary is getting off the ground. A year later, he married Judith Page Helm, and they would go on to have 5 children, 5 sons who survived to adulthood. 4 of those children would become Baptist ministers. 1860, Jones is ordained himself as a Baptist minister. And so the reason I bring this up is because Jones' Baptist heritage is really important for understanding what makes him tick. And it's also going to kind of tie into some of the other things I want to say in a few minutes about how denominationalism affected and shaped the way that he looked at white Southern memory. You also see here that Jones, had missionary ambitions. He envisioned going to China and being a missionary there. But you can also see that the year 1860, he's in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Foreign Mission Board is in no mood with all the political instability and lack of funding to start sending out missionaries at that particular moment. And sure enough, within a month of marrying Judith Page Helm, South Carolina will secede from the Union, and the trajectory of Jones's life changes drastically. Jones, once the war starts, now he's going to tell you in his writings that he had his trunks packed, he was ready to go to China, and then South Carolina secedes, and everything gets thrown out the window, all his plans. But I would say one plan ultimately is still fulfilled, and that is Jones's desire to be a missionary. I would suggest that he takes all that missionary zeal and he redirects it. He redirects it into Army chaplaincy. Joins the Louisa Blues that will become Company D of the 13th Virginia in 1861, spring of 1861. By October 1861, Jones has become a chaplain of the 13th Virginia. Now, his role here is going to kind of bounce around, and we don't necessarily have to get into the nitty-gritty details of how it does. There were different types of ministers in the Confederate Army. You could have regimental chaplains that were tied to a particular regiment. You had Army missionaries that were more tied to a denomination, weren't as tied to a regiment. And then you could have Army evangelists who oftentimes were sent by a local congregation. Jones is going to kind of transition from regimental chaplain to Army evangelist by the end of the war. The most important event, one of the most important events in his life spiritually during the war happens during 1862, when a series of revivals breaks out in the Confederate Army. Now, these revivals are going to significantly shape the way that Jones interprets the Confederate cause. He's very much going to merge the destiny of the Confederacy with his Baptist faith. He's going to hold them together. And he's ultimately going to argue that it is these revivals that demonstrate God's favor on the South, and by extension on the Confederate cause. Now, of course, the looming question in 1865 is that if the Confederates are God's favorite, how did they lose? So that will be a question he'll have to address as well. Not entirely germane to our conversation, but I do feel like I need to point this out. He did have two brothers who died, two younger brothers who died during the war. Ed, who was 19 years old when he was wounded at Gaines Mill, and Penn or Pendleton, who was wounded at Gettysburg. Both Ed and Pendleton are going to try and convalesce at home, but ultimately succumb to their wounds. The post-war period, Jones is going to serve various pastorates. He'll also serve as an agent for the Foreign Mission Board and for the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, a seminary that he describes himself as him having an almost idolatrous, those are his words, an idolatrous devotion to Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Serves as General Superintendent of the Sunday School Board of Virginia, as well as a staff writer for the Religious Herald Baptist newspaper in Virginia. Then served as an assistant corresponding secretary of the Home Mission Board and editor of the Southern Historical Society papers. A couple of things here. You see the recurring theme of Jones being a dyed-in-the-wool Baptist. That in and of itself is not remarkable. Many Southern Baptist ministers were dyed-in-the-wool Baptists. But again, this is going to affect the way Jones interprets the war, and especially those wartime revivals. Also, this last point here, being editor of the Southern Historical Society papers, you can see the dates here. It was 11 years that he served as an editor of these papers. And these Southern Historical Society papers, they're accessible online. I mean, you can go and you can read these. They essentially become one of the primary vehicles for the spread of the lost cause. And some people will point to Jones as being, as much as anyone else in the post-war South, a primary shaper of the lost cause because he's the editor of the Southern Historical Society papers. When you think about the work of an editor, I mean, clearly he's going to be the one who's determining what letters are being included, what accounts are being included, what arguments are being included. So we might say he's like someone taking all the pieces of Confederate memory and then making a mosaic out of it. And that mosaic is one that has a lot of staying power in the South, even after Jones has died. He was also a prolific author. 1874, his first really well-known work was Personal Reminiscences, Anecdotes, and Letters of General Robert E. Lee. This was a project that had actually fallen apart, and he kind of swoops in and salvages it. Lee had served as president of what was then Washington College until his death in 1870. After Lee died, Washington College, who would soon change its name to Washington and Lee University, they tried to cobble together some kind of memorial volume. Well, for any number of reasons, that memorial volume falls apart, and then Jones inserts himself. He always seems to be in the right place at the right time post-war. He swoops in there, says that he can pick up this volume and that he can complete it. He does. In 1874, his Personal Reminiscence, Anecdotes, and Letters of Robert E. Lee really sets the standard for future Lee biographies. In 1880, he publishes the Army of Northern Virginia Memorial Volume. Mostly he serves an editorial role in that volume. And then 1887, Christ in the Camp. Here, Jones is going to essentially tell the story of the Confederate revivals. Now, he will estimate in these Confederate revivals that upwards of 15,000 Confederates converted in the Army of Northern Virginia alone. Our scholars today will somewhere hover around 100 to 150,000 Confederate soldiers converting in total in the war, in all armies of the war. But Jones focuses on the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Christ in the Camp. 1896, he publishes the School History of the United States. This came about because he hated the textbook his son was using. In fact, one day there's the story of his son coming home with a history textbook and Jones flipping to the section where he finds the Civil War, and he doesn't like it. So he takes out his knife, literally. It's a copy paste job in the most literal sense. He takes his knife and starts cutting out the pages that talk about the Civil War. He doesn't think they're amenable to Southern interests. Gives this school book back to his son and tells him to go tell his teacher that if he's going to make you read that stuff, he's going to pull you out of the school. So this prompts Jones to write his own history of the United States, which is basically a history of the American Civil War. He spends more space in this book talking about the first year of the Civil War than he does the entire American Revolution. And it's extremely biased, even by 19th century standards. You had other white Southerners who were writing reviews of this book saying, wow, that's pretty partisan. And that infuriated Jones, that other white Southerners wouldn't back him up on the way he was interpreting the American Civil War. 1889, Jones is going to convince Jefferson Davis's widow to allow him to have access to Davis's papers, and he publishes the Davis Memorial Volume in 1889. Finally, 1906, because one biography of Robert E. Lee just isn't quite enough, he publishes the Life and Letters of Robert Edward Lee, Soldier and Man. In his final years, he's going to serve as chaplain at the University of Virginia and the University of North Carolina, as well as secretary and superintendent of the Confederate Memorial Association. Also serves as chaplain general of the UCV. You see in his life, really, he's keeping one foot in these Confederate organizations, one foot firmly planted in the Baptist Church. I don't know how much of a distinction he would have made between his life in these Confederate circles and his life in the Baptist Church. Other people would accuse him of blending them a little bit too seamlessly. This would be an accusation Jones would vehemently deny. He dies on March 17th, 1909 in Columbus, Georgia. So that's a very quick overview of Jones' life, what I'd like to do with our remaining time here is to draw out a few implications, things I think we can learn from Jones, mostly as a cautionary tale, but a few things I think Jones' story teaches us about the lost cause. So why is he important for the way we understand the lost cause and the way we understand the development of white Southern post-war memory? One reason I think he's important is because of what he tells us about denominational identity during the American Civil War. Prevalent scholarship has described these camp revivals that we talked about that began in late 1862 and continue in some form until the end of the war. Many scholars will talk about these revivals as a time of ecumenism, a time when denominational identity is being set aside for the common goal of conversion. All right. Now, in the abstract, that may make sense. Various denominations coming together to cooperate for a common purpose. Where I think this gets problematic, however, is when we start to portray these Confederate soldiers as soldiers who were not firmly committed to their denomination of choice. And I would argue they very much were, that even in these times of under these enormous strains and exigencies of war, that Confederate soldiers remained by and large, remained very loyal to their denominations of choice. And there's a few examples we could look at here. For example, you would have Confederate generals, no less than Stonewall Jackson, telling chaplains that they shouldn't preach sectarian sermons, okay? So from one angle, you look at that and say, all right, these chaplains are downplaying denominational identity. However, when you look at these non-sectarian sermons, you see that the motivation for preaching non-sectarian sermons is because so many soldiers are committed to their particular denomination. Chaplains were in very short supply during the American Civil War. It wasn't a buffet that you could just go and choose what chaplain you wanted to listen to. And so chaplains had a very diverse parish to whom they were preaching. That was the reason they needed to keep denominational sectarianism out of their sermons when possible. They even developed, believe it or not, a baptismal exchange program, another way of honoring denominational identity while at the same time cooperating with people who weren't necessarily of your particular background. This baptism exchange program would entail, for example, someone coming to a Baptist chaplain after a sermon and saying, I want to be baptized, but I want to be baptized as a Methodist. Well, someone like J. William Jones is not going to do that. And so he tries and helps to help that soldier locate a Methodist chaplain, wherever one is, and then he directs him there. I kind of think of this like the Santa Claus on Miracle on 34th Street. Like, we don't have that in our store, so I can direct you to a store that does have it. So you do have cooperation here. But again, it's cooperation that is rooted in denominational fidelity. It's not a dismissing of that denominational fidelity. The second thing I think Jones teaches us about the lost cause is about what it means to serve as an apostle for this mythology. Now, I named the book Apostle of the Lost Cause, and yeah, I was trying to be clever, but I actually did take this very seriously. This designation of apostleship, I really ended up letting that be an interpretive lens for the book. And I may anger some of my New Testament colleagues, I hope I don't, in how I'm defining apostle. But the way I defined apostleship in the book was to say that apostles had primarily two functions. Number one, preserve a faithful narrative of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And second, to testify to God's incarnation in Jesus Christ. So incarnation, faithful narrative. And once I started analyzing Jones through that lens, I really felt that I could see what was making him tick. He doesn't just flat out call himself an apostle of the Confederacy, but I think he very much functions as one. For example, he is intent on preserving a faithful narrative. He tells us that Robert E. Lee himself had commissioned J. William Jones to give an account of the revivals. In other words, he's received the personal commission to preserve what I would claim is a Confederate gospel. And then Jones sees that as his function. He has to defend that gospel against anyone who would deny it. I think Jones also points white Southerners to incarnations of virtue, or what he perceives as incarnations of virtue. So, for example, Jones is going to pay a lot of attention venerating Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Jefferson Davis. Now, I need to stay in my lane here. I realize that. I don't want to psychoanalyze him too much, but I wouldn't be the only historian to tell you that I think the post-war white South had a sense of disembodiment, that was something they were wrestling with. This idea of trying to preserve the Southern spirit without the Confederate body there. Jones steps in here and serves an important function because he embodies this Southern identity by directing white Southerners to these incarnations of Southern virtue. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Jefferson Davis, and others, but those three primarily. And if you want to relate this even further, if you want to bring this into the 21st century, I think you could make a strong case that a lot of the controversy over Confederate monuments, which is a topic we probably don't have time to get into tonight, I think they also kind of serve as this reification of Southern virtue for white Southerners that on some level, perhaps, are still feeling a sense of disembodiment. The third thing I think Jones teaches us about the lost cause is essentially concerning how we discuss memory in general. I would argue that Jones is establishing the discursive framework that we're still using today to talk about the lost cause. A couple of quick examples. Number one, Jones is going to go out of his way to tie Robert E. Lee to George Washington. Now, some of these connections do have some basis in fact. Lee's family did have connections with George Washington's family, through marriage. Robert E. Lee's father really did fight with George Washington in the American Revolution. But Jones exploits these connections and essentially tries to make Robert E. Lee look like George Washington reincarnate. And when he does so, he's weaving two mythologies together. And you can see pictured here, this is George Washington on the Confederate seal. This wasn't something unique to Jones. Many Southerners would refer to Robert E. Lee as or George Washington rather, as the rebel of 1776. They would describe what George Washington was doing in the American Revolution as seceding from Britain. So they're really trying to weave together these mythologies. Why is this important? It's important because even today, when you have people arguing over Confederate monuments, almost without fail, you'll have someone say, well, if you take down a monument to Robert E. Lee, then what are you going to do with monuments to Thomas Jefferson and George Washington? Folks, that is exactly the kind of conversation that J. William Jones would want us to be having in 2022. He wanted it to be so that those mythologies were so blended together that you couldn't talk about one without talking about the other. Another way that he shapes the way we think about memory, you often hear people, especially with regard to the Confederate flag or Confederate monuments, talk about erasing history, the dangers of erasing history. Well, there have been attempts to erase history, and I'm going to give you a prime example, and it's coming from J. William Jones. Pictured here is General James Longstreet. Many of you have probably heard of him before. He was not a small-time player in the Confederate Army. He was Robert E. Lee's right-hand man, especially after the death of Stonewall Jackson in the spring of 1863. Longstreet's pedigree, if you're just looking at the battles he was involved in, unparalleled. Lee had called him the staff in my right hand and my old war horse. Everyone knew James Longstreet. However, after the war, Longstreet commits two unpardonable sins. Number one, he aligns himself with the Republican Party and cooperates with Reconstruction. Number two, he has the audacity to criticize Robert E. Lee. Specifically, he's going to criticize what Robert E. Lee did at Gettysburg. Now, this lights a fire in J. William Jones and other ex-Confederates like Jubal Early. You probably heard that name before as well. And they, Early and Jones, mount an orchestrated campaign to obliterate the reputation of James Longstreet. That's not conspiracy theory. That's not conjecture. We have the letters that they're writing to each other where they're using the language of, I want you to, quote, slice up what is left of James Longstreet. In other words, erase him from history. Now, people still remember James Longstreet in the post-war South after he dies, but his memory has become so tarnished by his death that it can't be rehabilitated. There were Confederate groups that refused to send condolences. There were white Southerners writing into newspapers, writing horrendous things, such as they wish James Longstreet had been killed in battle so he wouldn't have lived long enough to, quote, betray his race. Now, what's interesting is when most of these Confederate monuments are going up in the late 19th, early 20th century, Longstreet's not going to have those monuments. You will be able to find a couple of markers. You'll be able to find a marker for James Longstreet in Georgia, one in South Carolina. And in 1990, about 100 years, in the 1990s, about 100 years after most of the other monuments went up, he finally had a monument placed in Gettysburg. So I often tell students that if you want to talk about a race in history, then you don't need to look any further than James Longstreet if you can find him anywhere. Lastly, Confederate symbols here. The way that many people continue to talk about Confederate symbols, namely the Confederate battle flag, that is very much shaped by what J. William Jones was doing as well. J. William Jones and others begins this practice of bifurcating Confederate memory to the extent that he starts making an artificial distinction between the Confederate battle flag, what we might, the saltire, that blue X on the red background, and the stars and bars, or the Confederate First National flag. He starts to make some distinction between the two, and other Confederates do this as well. Other ex-Confederates do this as well. What they start saying is that the First National Confederate flag, that represents secession. That represents the politics of slavery. But the other, the battle flag, the one that you will often see if you're driving down the road, and someone 9 times out of 10, it will be that Confederate battle flag. That battle flag represents the common soldier, the soldier who wasn't an enslaver, the soldier who didn't care about the politics of secession, but was just fighting for home and hearth. Now, that artificial distinction allowed a couple of things. It allowed Jones to kind of tap into what he thought were quintessentially American virtues. The common soldier was still practicing and exhibiting these American virtues, and therefore could still be honored, right? And he's also able to just kind of suspend these virtues in the ether. They never have to touch the ground. He can talk about states' rights, but never say what those states' rights were trying to defend. Right. He can talk about intrepidness in the face of battle, but never going further to say that that intrepidness was in an attempt to build a slaveholding society. So this bifurcation still happens very much today. People today are still arguing that there is a difference between the politics of secession and the virtues espoused by Confederate soldiers. I want to close here briefly the next 5 minutes that we have here to just kind of gesture in the direction of some ways that Jones' story might speak to Baptist churches today. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, just a few thoughts maybe to bounce around as you're thinking, okay, I see Jones, certainly not someone I want to emulate. I'm not going to put a poster of J. William Jones up in my office or anything like that, but does his story speak to my situation, to our congregations? And I think it does. One thing I think his story teaches us is that hermeneutics are important, but also dangerous. And this is something we could say about the American Civil War in general, not just J. William Jones. Somewhere along the line in the 19th century, Christians in the North and the South could no longer talk to each other. The way they were interpreting the Bible, and we don't have to get into the details about how and why they were interpreting. I mean, that's a fascinating study in and of itself. But suffice it to say that well before the political divisions manifest in 1860, ecclesial divisions had portended that. The Methodists in 1844, Baptists in 1845, Presbyterians in 1861. These evangelical denominations are splintering. And part of the reason is because they are disagreeing about the Bible and they have lost the ability to talk with each other. Now, today, and you may share a similar frustration here, I hear a lot of people talk about Christians who can't seem to communicate any longer, as if we're talking two different languages, whether it's hermeneutics, whether it's theology, whether it's politics, that we don't even have enough ground anymore, that we're living in the same reality. That is a frustration I think a lot of us share. But I would also caution that that's a very dangerous place to be. Mark Knoll writes this, and we might say that he's being overly cynical here, but still, I think it is worth hearing again. For the history of theology in America, Knoll writes, the great tragedy of the Civil War is that the most persuasive theologians were the Reverend Doctors William Tecumseh Sherman and Ulysses S. Grant. Something to keep in mind. Second observation, I would say beware the perils of denominationalism. Yes, that is a horrendous pun. I should be banned from ever doing another webinar ever. But hear me out for a second. J. William Jones, I told you that he's able to kind of move back and forth between his Confederate circles and his Baptist circles, and he doesn't really see a distinction between the two. He will say that he does. Other Baptists will accuse him of bringing his Confederate politics into the pulpit. Jones will say that he's not doing that. But to him, if you read what he's writing, if you read if you hear his sermons, read his sermons, you see that he is very much blending the destiny of the Confederate nation, even the nation abstractly post-war, with his faith, and he puts them together very seamlessly. Now, having said that, we also need to just be honest here. That temptation to merge religion and nationalism, that's not unique to J. William Jones. It's not unique to Baptist. It's not unique to the South. And it's certainly not unique to the 19th century. That is still very much a temptation to tie the nationalism with faith. And if we don't recognize that, we do that to our own detriment. Finally, another thing I think Jones' story can really do to speak to our congregations. Reconciliation is good, except when it's not. I mentioned before this reconciliationist narrative that tried to talk about the American Civil War without talking about race, without talking about slavery. I think that's still a temptation in some circles, to think that because the Civil War is over, because the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s is over, that somehow we've moved beyond racial discord, that somehow everything is fixed. Now, a lot of people will not say that, but a few people would. They think everything's been reconciled. And the fact is, it hasn't. In the past 3 years, you and I, of no choice of our own, have got a crash course in epidemiology. We know that viruses mutate. Racism mutates as well. We may feel like we're inoculated to a 19th century version of it, or perhaps a Jim Crow version of it. But that doesn't mean we aren't susceptible to iterations of white supremacy today. And we fall susceptible to it when we deny that it's still going on. Reconciliation is good, but it's good when it comes with repentance. Repentance is admitting the mistakes of the past, and not only admitting those mistakes, but understanding how there's still ramifications of those mistakes right now. I'm going to close with this slide. I opened with a fancy quote. Let me close with a fancy quote. This one's not mine, though. This comes from German philosopher Ernest Cassirer. He writes, the relation between myth and history, myth proves to be the primary, history the secondary and derived factor. It's not by its history that the mythology of a nation is determined, but conversely, its history is determined by its mythology. Now, instead of getting into the weeds about whether we agree with Cassirer or not, I will say this. I do believe that that line between history and mythology is often very, very blurry. We may want to make a hard distinction between the two, but I don't think we can. The reason I don't think we can is because histories and mythologies are often trying to answer the same fundamental questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? Why are we here? And so that blending, we look at that, and sometimes those mythologies that emerge from that, they produce something positive, perhaps. Maybe they appeal to the better angels of our nature. Some of those mythologies do not, and they tap into our basest instincts. It's here that I think J. William Jones serves as a cautionary tale. Yes, in much of what he's doing, in the mythology he's disseminating, he's trying to answer those fundamental questions: who we are, where we came from, why are we here? But I think he also does so in a very damaging way, in a way that's not only historically inaccurate, but in a way that's still haunting the way that we talk about memory today. Just something to keep in mind the next time you're reading a history book, or heck, the next time you're getting money from an automated teller machine. That's my time. I will turn it back over to Dr. Gardner.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Moore. That was fantastic. And the next part of our program, Reverend Hughes, if you'd like to offer some words of reflection and response from that.
Thank you, Dr. Gardner and Dr. Moore. Fantastic job in your presentation. And I'm humbled by the opportunity to offer some thoughts after having read this book and obviously been able to enjoy your lecture. The first reflection that I have is myself being a Southern white male. Grew up in upstate South Carolina, and not that it was something that inundated my life by any stretch, but certainly it was something that I came into contact in which I would remember as a child walking into various homes of friends and neighbors and seeing pictures that depicted General Lee or Stonewall Jackson around the campfire on the eve before battle, or charging courageously out onto the battlefront with their soldiers. I remember as a child going to the South Carolina State Museum and seeing very valiant depictions of Southern generals and Southern Civil War soldiers. And so in my mind, I always wondered why. Why was their stature and their character promoted to such a high elevation? And your book shed light on that. It shed light on why they were depicted as people of extreme virtue, what I will call Christian exceptionalism. They were certainly presented in that light. And so in my thoughts, I now understand the lost cause. I've heard that, but I never understood. So my understanding was this is a reaction to what was believed to be a threat to regional identity of who they were and why they existed. Moreover, it was a response to a war that Southerners believed they were to win by divine favor. And then when they lost, having to deal with the resulting tension of wondering why or how could they lose if in fact they were God's chosen people. Oftentimes when we feel like we live experiences in vain, we try to create systems of justification, a methodology to cope with why things happened the way they did. So for our people that were perpetuating and creating this lost cause mythology, they were in essence stating that while still having lost, they were still superior in character. It's interesting to me because the saying goes, and I can't give you the quote for who wrote it, but history is written by the victors. However, this isn't the case. History is written by those who lost. This is an anomaly to the extreme. They lost the war. They lost the ability to defend the peculiar institution for which they thought they were defending. And yet, as a result, they created their own alternate version of history. And they will now live in that tension, knowing that there are two disparate versions of history, which makes unity virtually impossible. And I see that as a pastor relating to today, the alternate version of history of the lost cause, I think still hides in the corners of hearts and minds, and even in the church house pews. Specifically, I think that it provides distinct tension and difficulty for conversations of racial reconciliation, because no such conversation can proceed when individuals still venerate an era of history and its leaders whose reason for leading was to defend the institution of slavery and the subjugation of African American people. So that was note number one. I think it explained to me so much of what I remember seeing as a child and even as an adult, and just wondering, well, why is that? In the city of Carrollton, where we live, why is it that we have a spire that's right in front of the courthouse that's a Confederate War monument, and adjacent to that, not but 20 feet, is a monument to Martin Luther King Jr.? Well, why would those two things be in such close proximity? This book, your work, helps me understand that in a new way. I also was called to the title, Apostle of the Lost Cause, who was J. William Jones, as you wrote about. As I'm looking into the life of this individual, nobody can argue his passion for Baptist life and Christianity. And conversely, nobody can argue for his belief that Southern generals and armies were God's anointed. Nobody can doubt that passion. In his life, I really see the major moment of decision, the major moment of what his ministry is going to look like, appear as he then uses Baptist life, and specifically Baptist Christianity, to support the perpetuation of the Confederate memory. And similarly, he uses his guru status as a Confederate insider, and as one who has selected memory of Confederate generals and leaders to build the Baptist church. And so in so many words, and I think, Dr. Moore, you already alluded to this earlier, but specifically to how it deals with the late 20th and early 21st century, is it seems like Jones was an early proponent of the God and country theme of church that is so dominant within many evangelical communities today, and dare I say, really was highlighted and pronounced in 2020. That the God and country theme, and that is something that many churches still use as a way to build political profile for said party, or to build their own church body. I believe the word that you used is appropriate. Hermeneutics are wonderful, but also hermeneutics are very dangerous, because in elevating human beings to Christocentric figures like J. William Jones did for Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, you put something that's contesting the rightful place of Jesus Christ as the king of creation, and to which everyone is subject. Everyone is unworthy. And I think that's a calling card to us in the church today, that we need be aware of anything that dares encroach upon the rightful place of Jesus Christ. That was my third note. And then my last and final note was how you so well depicted the conditionality of the denominational fraternity. In camp situations in wartime, it was almost commonsensical for them to say, let's lower guards for fencing around denomination lines, and let's pool our efforts for these camp revivals. Post-war, it was similarly convenient to band with other Protestant churches for services and events that promoted Confederate memory and Southern exceptionalism. But it also seems like, as you depicted in any other circumstance, whether it was J. William Jones or other ministers that were mentioned, ecumenical partnerships were not embraced, even disparaged, especially if it had anything to do with the Roman Catholic Church. And so as a minister, I still believe these conditional denominational alliances exist when it's convenient or when it's out of moments of crisis. And for me, the greater desire, the greater want is to see a larger community come around the one constant. It's not condition, it's constant, that we worship a risen Savior in Christ Jesus. And that is something in which I think needs to enable us to be arm in arm with our brothers and sisters, be they Lutheran, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, Methodist, Catholic, or other, and to follow Christ together, especially in an age of post-Christian, secular age thought. It's more important now than ever that we understand that there are far more things that we agree upon as Christ as Savior, as Christ as resurrected Savior, as Christ as leader of the church, than what we disagree upon. So that's my last note. And if it's okay, Dr. Gardner, I wanted to be the first that might be able to ask our lecturer and author a question.
That would be great. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. As I read your book, Dr. Moore, I was mesmerized by the intensity and the detail that you obviously put in to studying an alternate version of history. It's heavily biased, and of course, we realize that as we read it, especially in the in-depth detail that you use as Jones paired Robert E. Lee with Christ in what would be many ridiculous ways. But I guess what my question is as a historian, how were you then able to take such an alternate narrative of history that's still prevalent today and then balance it with reality? How are you able to bring it back so that there can be, it's not that there weren't Southern War heroes or Southern War generals. It's not that they didn't exist. They did exist, but there's also the reality that a lot of what we think and believe is myth. How are you able, as a historian, to help us even out the tide there?
Well, thank you, Reverend Hughes. Thank you for the kind words. I really, they mean a lot to me. And that's also a really good question. And to be confessional, that's something I still wrestle with. I remember when I was doing master's work, I was writing a thesis on Stonewall Jackson and his veneration, and almost like a precursor to eventually settling on J. William Jones. And I remember someone asking me, just very pointedly, well, what was reality? You're describing this alternate reality, but in order to understand it as alternate, you need something to balance it with, and that's something I struggle with, because I really think Jones and others, once they created this new reality, that was their reality. Every once in a while, I would want to kind of bring things back to primary sources. That's kind of a boilerplate answer. But wherever you could catch Jones saying something that the primary sources are directly refuting, That's one thing I would do. Plus, there's a few times Jones would throw me a softball because he would redact certain letters. He would redact letters of Robert E. Lee, because by the time he was doing his biographies of Lee, he did not want Lee to be connected with slavery at all. Even though he, out of one side of his mouth, he's saying the war's not about slavery. At the same time, he's hedging his bet, saying if Lee mentions anything about purchasing a slave or enslaved persons at Arlington, he goes in there and starts redacting those letters. Now, I didn't discover this. I wish I could say I did. But I kind of followed the lead of other historians and then was able to go into the archives and compare literally something Robert E. Lee wrote with how Jones quotes it in his book. And again, that was kind of a softball at that point where you can, and kind of one of my highlights and in kind of a weird way to just see so clearly how he's manipulating the sources. And so I guess my short answer would be to really get into those primary sources as much as I could. Because if I'm going to talk about this alternate reality, I really do need to present some kind of alternative and say where he's really jumping the rails here into kind of creating this mythology. That's a great question.
Great. Yeah. So we are into our question and answer time period. I'd request that if you have a question, and I hope you do, we have plenty of time for questions, that you raise your hand with the reactions. Oh, I see Dr. Allen, you have done that. You can take it away with your question. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. This has been really interesting for me and well presented, Dr. Moore. I'm teaching a class on Baptist heritage at McAfee School of Theology, even now. As a matter of fact, one of my students is signed on. Jason, are you still there? Jason Banks is one of my students.
I'm here, Doc.
Yeah, and Jason, is your hair combed well enough that you could put your image on the screen?
I only wish. I'm out and about, and I just wanted to make sure that I could try to join in and listen. Great presentation tonight, though. I really, truly enjoyed it.
I appreciate it. Jason is an African-American. That's why I wanted his picture on the screen. So about half my class is African-American. I had them read Warren's sermon, which is very much from the Lost Cause. He was pastor at First Baptist Macon, and he is biblically defending slavery. And when my students read it, white or black, the question rises, how could they think that way? And one of the questions that came in the last class, in our last week's class, was from a young African-American student. She said, okay, they lost the war. So what did they say then? And that's the question that I hear David asking. I mean, how do they then defend once they've lost the war and go on being Christian? That's getting at what happens to that reality. My question is, I got two questions, but the first one is, that's the prolegomena for it. And the first one is, so Dr. Moore, what did they do with slavery? I mean, they were talking about slave owners. And a subset of that question is, Jones surely would have been supportive of slavery. So what do they do with slavery in the Lost Cause?
Thank you, Dr. Allen. That is that's another really good question, and kind of gets at the heart of what I think is the most problematic aspect out of a host of problematic aspects of the Lost Cause. I think that's the most problematic. What do they do with slavery? Say a few things there. Early Lost Cause writers, and I think this is where it really gets interesting. Early Lost Cause writers, such as the journalist who coins the phrase Lost Cause, Edward Pollard, he actually is, when he's writing in 1866, he's pretty adamant that the war was not only about slavery, it was about white supremacy. So you will have authors who do that every once in a while, but in the more I read, the more that those voices don't seem to kind of they don't seem to catch on to folks like Jones, who feel like the best way to talk about slavery is never to mention it, just to pretend like it was. And something else they do, and this is just some really rhetorical acrobatics, but it comes up repeatedly. They start talking about the difference between cause and occasion. And they start saying slavery was the occasion of the war. The cause was states' rights. The cause was Lincoln's election. The cause is government overreach. Now, the occasion just happened to be slavery. Back in the 1830s, it was the Tariff of Abominations. You know, it could have happened at any time. It just now the final straw, it broke the camel's back, and that was that happened in 1860. So it just happened to be there. But something else you said is really fascinating as well. What do they do with, you know, having lost the war? And believe it or not, I mean, they go right back to the Bible, because they can see precedent for the chosen people being defeated. So they are very much all the time comparing themselves to Judah, and the north is Babylon. And that just unleashes for them any number of ways they can go with that, because then they say, well, look what happened to the empire of Babylon. Chosen people are still around. Babylon's not. So we're going to endure. They start citing Psalms, you know, even ones that kind of passive aggressive hermeneutics, where they cite, you know, don't boast, our harps are hanging on the willows. And at the same time, there you've got the part about the dashing the babies against the rocks. So it's passive aggressive hermeneutics. But I would say that they locate themselves as the chosen people, saying that this is not punishment, this is chastisement. There's a difference. We're not being condemned. God only chastises the one that God loves. And so ironically, they flip this to mean, see, this proves that we're the chosen people, because we're still central in the divine plan, the North incidental, and eventually they'll fade away.
On a Zoom meeting.
Andrew, one more question.
Sure.
And that is, I did not understand, Dr. Moore. It was not clear to me what the disembodiment meant when you talked about that they use these figures to reify, to incarnate this disembodied thing. Is that, what do you mean by that? That the disembodiment was that the culture had been collapsed or destroyed? Just what? I'm not sure what you mean by the disembodiment.
Sure. Yeah. And I'm picking that up from a few other historians and just trying to kind of run with it. Robert Penn Warren had made that comment many years ago about the greatest fear for white Southerners was abstraction and the fear of disembodiment. What I meant by that was essentially that the Confederacy, once the Confederate government is no more, that they're still trying to preserve this Southern identity. They want to remain distinct from the Northerners. I mean, the nation is ostensibly reunited, but they want to preserve that sense of Southern identity. And that's what I mean by this sense of disembodiment. And a way I think you can, that it kind of comes out a little bit more clearly, I didn't mention this, is through the way that Jones' writings compare to other people who are writing about Southern religion. A Methodist chaplain named William Bennett had wrote about the Confederate revivals in a lot of detail, and had done so 10 years before Jones completed his work. But most people don't hear about William Bennett. Most people aren't citing from his work. And I think when you kind of do a side-by-side comparison, one of the big differences is that Bennett is not really going to focus in on these individuals. That veneration of Confederate leaders seems, to me at least, to put Jones in just a separate category. And he really gets to this point, as Reverend Hughes mentioned, of really putting them on this Christ-like level. And I think, and he's also going to say that he knew, it's not just that he's doing it, it's that I knew Robert E. Lee. I touched Robert E. Lee. Like, I am the apostle who has received the commission to do this. I knew Jefferson Davis. That's how he gets permission to do the memorial volume. He sidles up to Davis, buddies up to him. Now, Jackson, that's a little bit harder. He's not able to do a whole book on Jackson. He didn't know him as well. But he is going to repeatedly talk about his intimate connection and how I, J. William Jones, can give you insight to their religious life in a way no one else can. And I really think that's him kind of trying to grab onto that apostolic identity, whether he says he's trying to do that or not.
Thank you. Other questions? You can type them into the chat if you'd prefer. Use the reaction to raise your hand.
I'll go again if no one else does, because I've got some others, if that's okay.
Sure, David. Okay. And then we can go back to Lloyd. Yeah, go ahead, David.
Okay. So as we read about J. William Jones, the reaction of the reader is, well, he's to be blamed for something. He's to be blamed for the creation of a lost cause mythology that is an alternate version of history that's untrue. And yet I can't help but think that in some way, in terms of knowing history, in terms of knowing some details of history, we strangely have him to thank, perhaps, for his comprehensive work on generals and camp life and things of that nature. So I guess my question is, as you write about him, do you feel like you're thanking him in a way, or do you feel like you're blaming him, or do you feel like it's a mixture of both emotions?
Yeah, that's another really good question. When I was doing my research, I was spending a lot of time in Richmond, and he's actually interred at Hollywood Cemetery, along with a lot of other Confederate luminaries there. And I remember going and finding his grave, his headstone. You had other Confederates that were out there in the cemetery, the big monuments, really imposing. And there he was, just kind of tucked away there. And I had this weird feeling I still haven't really been able to articulate, looking at his headstone, wondering, okay, I've spent a lot of time with you. I've pretty much spent an entire book saying how wrong-headed what you did was. And at the same time, I was doing my dissertation, I was like, at the same time, I am benefiting from this in some way, looking at your story. And I'll say something else, though. I mean, you mentioned how much have other historians drawn on him? They do. I mean, they do all the time. And that's one thing that has struck me about J. William Jones. Pretty much any historian, and we're not talking about lost causers, we're just any historian who has written on, especially Confederate religion in the Confederate armies, they are going to be citing Jones. You have to find them in the footnotes, though. They're not necessarily just going to say, well, here's what J. William Jones is saying. They're always drawing on him. And he started to come across to me as one of those actors that you see pop up in every single movie you see, but they're always an extra and you never know their name. I've seen that person in every single movie I watch. He started to become that kind of character to me. And so what I wanted to do is kind of bring him into the top billing. I wanted to kind of bring him forward and say, this is the guy who's been working behind the scenes, who's been working in the footnotes. And as I mentioned before, I kind of see him as taking a bunch of stories and kind of piecing together this picture, and giving Southerners the picture that they wanted to see about themselves. And that's, you've got history, you've got all these records and primary sources, but you also have the story that you want to believe about yourself. And I think that's where you start going into mythology. And I think that's what he really provides. He provides Southerners the story that they wanted to hear. But yes, to your question, he still provides a wealth. A lot of his books are mostly citations from others. He's not, he will write his own words, but they're more like a source book, a lot of them. So yeah, we still, if you want to say we have him to thank, he is preserving, when he's not redacting the primary sources, he is preserving quite a few of them.
Great, thank you. We've got 2 questions. We're going to go with Marjorie, and then we're going to go with the one in the chat.
Hi, that was an incredible talk, and I really enjoyed you focusing on how religion being used in the moment to create the myth and sustain the myth. I have a lot of questions broader than your book, which is this seems to be something we see in the Old Testament quite a bit. It seems to be something that's implicit perhaps in all state religions, and is part of bringing many nations together under one religion. And so you find these national groups or these national identities separating off and using religion as a weapon. But the question I have for you, and it may be bigger than this, is there were Baptists, very active Baptist congregations outside of the South. They were in the North at this time. What kinds of conversations were developing among these churches as a result of what was happening in the South with the development of this myth? I mean, was there pushback, or was there any kind of unity, or were they also independent that it was meaningless?
Yes, thank you for that question. And I mentioned before how you do have Baptists in the South cooperating perhaps at arm's length with other Southern denominations. A lot of that cooperation is coming out of wanting to maintain a distinct identity, Southern identity, as opposed to Northerners. But when the nation is reunited post-war, Southern Baptists and Northern Baptists, they don't come back together. And Jones actually, believe it or not, some of his fiercest rhetoric comes out toward Northern Baptists. And that was something that surprised me a little bit, I guess. I thought that maybe he would be a little bit more ironic he says things like the war's in the past and it's over, but he really does go after Northern Baptists. Many white Southerners during Reconstruction saw Northern ministers who were coming down South as invading. They're now these missionaries are invading, coming, trying to minister to formerly enslaved persons, trying to impose their beliefs on us, their literature on us. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but I will say that he saved some of his harshest venom for Northern Baptists. He really didn't feel like reuniting with them at all.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marjorie. We have a question in the chat from Ken Russell about how would you answer this history school teacher, what he told his students? The South lost the Civil War, but won Reconstruction.
True. Yes. I mean, that's what happens. I mean, you have you've got Reconstruction scholars like Eric Foner who are going to tell you that the failure of Reconstruction was not that we tried it, it was that we never finished it. And I tell students that it's like when you go to the doctor and the doctor never tells you, hey, take this antibiotic until you feel better, and then stop it. You have to finish the regiment. And I would agree with Foner. The Reconstruction, you have so many flashes of brilliance, over 1,000 African-Americans serving in public office. And some of the Hiram Revels, first African-American senator coming out of Mississippi, the same state that elected Jefferson Davis to the Senate. I tell this to students and they look at me just glazed over, like there's no way that Mississippi was sending an African-American man into the Senate. And so, yeah, I would say that when Reconstruction ends and you have these redemption governments, I talk about the monuments as being these embodiments, but I also think they're trophies. I mean, I think that's probably a more candid way of saying it. They're trophies of a redeemed South. When whites take back over the governments, that's when the vast majority of these monuments go up. And I think it's a victory lap.
Thank you. Thank you.
We've got time for maybe one or two more questions. Yeah, Lloyd.
I don't want to go if somebody else has a question, but I cannot resist contemporary events. You just said that he said, if you don't teach the history like I want it taught, I'm taking my kid out of school. Front page news, Waynesboro paper. Front page news, we're taking our kids out. And in the Atlanta paper, which I also take, Cobb County. Teach American history as it was, as we want to hear it was, or we're done with you. An understanding of America that doesn't want to talk about slavery. So we'll just skip slavery. And if slavery comes up, we're gonna get in some way around it. Well, it wasn't so bad as it was depicted. And I don't think I have a question here, Dr. Moore, for a historian, but I don't think we ought to talk about this without asking, so how might that have been avoided? Because if it might have been avoided, maybe we can avoid it. So what do we need to do in the midst of it happening in many of the same principles at work in current history? The desire to build a mythology. As you're reading it, surely you ask yourself, well, we need to ...
Well, I mean, so since you want to get controversial, we might as well jump in with both feet. I think where this becomes especially fraught is when you see how this mythology is able to kind of be woven into the American mythology. I mean, Jones will eventually come to the point later in life where he is defending why white Southerners should be proud of the American flag, because the American flag represents the American virtues that white Southerners were fighting for. See, again, there's that bifurcation of not about slavery and secession. It's these virtues over here. And we're just like all the other Americans, like the 1776 Americans. And so we can take even more pride. He'll make that argument too. Southerners can take more pride in the American flag than Northerners could. So here's where that gets kind of controversial. I would argue that one reason that mythology was able to kind of unite with back into mainstream is because of how mythologized America already was and continues to be. That the idea of separating principles from ends, these virtues from perhaps the direction these virtues were being deployed. Americans were already doing that before the American Civil War. I would say we continue to do that. And so that's where we really just have to have a reckoning as a nation, as historians, as educators, because I don't think it was by accident that when you start talking about those American virtues, now you're able to blend back in, because we've already abstracted those things. And they're not necessarily touching the ground. Like, what were these virtues being used? What were we fighting for? And oftentimes we're going to talk in abstractions as opposed to materially what was going on. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's how I see it.
Great, thank you. And I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has one.
No, we want to go.
Any questions? Nikki, do you have a question?
No.
Oh, sorry. If not, thank you all so much for attending this evening. We're grateful for your support. I have two requests for you. The first, I'm going to let the Executive Director of the Baptist History and Heritage Society tell you a little bit about the upcoming annual meeting.
Thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. Chris, great presentation. And David, thank you for your response and for the help of your church in promoting this. I just wanted the opportunity to give a brief commercial for our annual conference, which again this year is going to be a virtual event. Still difficult for a number of our people to travel, fly on airplanes and gather in groups. So we're doing a virtual annual conference. It begins 4 weeks from today. The dates are May 26 and 27, a Thursday and Friday. It'll run roughly from mid-afternoon on Thursday to the mid-afternoon on Friday. Our theme is Baptist and Science, which seem to some to be mutually exclusive categories. They are not. We have two excellent plenary addresses, one by Paul Wallace, who's a professor at Agnes Scott College in Atlanta, and he is speaking to the theme Baptist and Science, kind of giving us a broad view. The other plenary address is by Fisher Humphreys, emeritus professor from Stanford University, and he is talking about the life and career of John Houghton, I think that's how he pronounces his name, who was a British Baptist and world-renowned climatologist. I believe I'm right that he won the Nobel Prize, shared it with Al Gore, but personifies the ability to bring Baptist faith together as a professional scientist. In addition to those plenary addresses, we have several papers, briefer papers on themes related to science, a historical view of how Baptists have looked at the origins of life, another paper on Tennessee Baptists and the Scopes Monkey trial. We have an Old Testament scholar looking at Clyde T. Francisco's interpretation of Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3 with a view toward modern science. And we have other papers on slavery and devotional ideas, family altar, a lot of different other papers as well. So it'll be a wonderful 24-hour period. You do need to register, and there is a modest fee to participate. If you'll do that, we'll send you the sign-in information, and we begin mid-afternoon on May 26th. We'd love to have all of you and anyone you know who might be interested to participate. A year from now, we hope to be back to in-person annual conference again, but one more year as a virtual one. Thank you, Andrew, for that chance to say a word about our meeting.
Sure, and you can see the link in the chat. I'll also ask one more thing, a link in the chat for you to follow Baptist History and Heritage on Facebook. If you liked this webinar, we'll have more coming soon. Our webinar for the month of May, which may be in early June, we're still identifying a time, will center on Dr. Joao Chavez's The Global Mission of the Jim Crow South.